with the 4090 not being able to keep up at native res at 4K 60 FPS on the latest games, BMW and Star Wars, are we about to face a massive performance war with upcoming releases, especially those cars without decent frame generation? John?
Um, I mean, I kind of feel like we're just following the natural progression of game performance, right? Like, as hardware ages, more powerful or more extreme games start releasing, and we see the maximum performance decrease. It's fairly normal stuff. But I will say, though, is that while what he's saying is true, that only really applies to those games when you're talking about pushing the visual level up to the max. Right.
Yeah.
These games are simply allowing you to push the visuals to a next level with more advanced ray tracing features and taking full advantage of what's on offer. In both cases, I found that using a 4090, I was able to get essentially 120 FPS or thereabouts, or very high frame rates by simply dialing back certain settings. You do lose visuals that absolutely, especially with Star Wars, I would say, where, disabling the high-end ray tracing features dramatically alters the look of the game. But if you really want that high performance, you can still get it, right? But
Yeah.
it's just we're in that natural point in the life cycle. And I think new cars will come along. But I guess the thing that's more concerning to me is how much frame generation is starting to become a requirement due mainly to CPU limitations, where I feel like CPUs are starting to stagnate or become more of a bottleneck on PC than they used to be, which,
Right.
you know what I mean? Where it just feels like usually with most games, like these two games, notwithstanding, which where obviously they are also bottlenecked by the graphics card. I often find that my main issue with getting higher frame rates is CPU related. Now, I'm not using the latest CPU, but if you look at the benchmarks that you and others have done on the latest CPUs, I don't feel like we're seeing like leaps and bounds in terms of performance increase there. And if a game is CPU limited, it's, there's not that much you can do usually to solve that, which is why frame generation is so important.
Yeah. Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, this question, I'm not too sure that I agree with the framing of it, because native res at 4K is really intense on GPUs, and I don't really think that's a fair point
Oh
of
yeah,
comparison.
you're right. I wasn't even thinking about it from that
Yeah.
perspective. I was just talking like in general, but yeah, native res is a waste.
It's
Big
brutal.
waste.
It's brutal, and it's a big waste, exactly, with upsampling with DLSS or XCSS in particular. Also other solutions, but in particular those two solutions, I think you can get away easily with 1080p internal rendering performance mode, as it's dubbed, at 4K. That would be a fair point of reference because you're getting generally comparable image quality to native 4K with a lot of TA implementations, but with a much lower load. I think it'd be more of a concern if games were dipping below that standard, like below that 4K DLSS performance mode standard. But even still, for a game that's pushing out really advanced visual effects, like advanced ray tracing, if it's one of those NVIDIA full ray tracing branded titles, I think that 1440p 60 personally for me, upscaled from maybe something like 900p, would be perfectly reasonable even on a high-end PC. If it is pushing out more advanced visual effects, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And it also has not always been the case that games come out and run perfectly on PC at high resolutions at high frame rates with max settings. That is a more recent phenomenon. In the past, in the 2000s, that wasn't always necessarily the case. Certainly wasn't the case with the original Crysis. So I think people need to recalibrate their expectations and think about, okay, instead of trying to achieve the absolute maximum that I can achieve on a 4K display at 60 FPS, maybe I should think about what produces a good experience on a 4K display and gives me those top-end visual features. And I think a 4090 will be capable of that for years to come. I don't think it's in a great deal of threat from games at the moment.
To add to that, I just think in a world where, well, there's two things to this. First of all, games are being developed with consoles in mind. They want to get a great PlayStation 5 version out there, which means that, this performance war is always going to be, offset by the fact that these games need to run well and look good on, mass market console devices. It's that simple. The question is, I mean, I agree with you, Oliver. There's a lot of issues with the framing of this question. First of all, the concept of a 4090 not being able to run at native res at 4K 60. First of all, technologies like Unreal Engine are literally built with upscaling in mind. to the point where they built their own upscaler. I mean, that's just the way it is. So, the concept of what a game is delivering visuals wise, it is being, there is additional levels of ambition there simply because upscaling is expected to be in the mix, even with a 4090. I think that's fair enough. Secondly, the concept of max settings, or if you're running Star Wars with the fully unlocked max settings. I mean, this is not designed for the hardware of today, which is why Star Wars actually requires you to have a kind of command line prompt to get it working. It's designed to scale into the future, which I think is an admirable thing to do on the PC version of games, not just thinking about the hardware today, but the hardware tomorrow. That doesn't mean you can't get a great experience with a 4090. So, there's a lot going on here. I agree, though, with you, John, that there are issues mostly with CPUs, especially sort of more mainstream orientated CPUs. And frame generation has a really powerful part to play there. I mean, we've seen it time and time again, because you literally double your performance and it takes you into the VRR range or beyond it, or so to the point where you cap it, where, it's definitely worth doing, and you have to do it simply because CPUs are not scaling to the same degree as GPUs. So it's a bit of a tricky question, that one.
I wanted one fun thing while Star Wars is being referenced. I actually experimented with 40 FPS, as we always talk about for consoles with the gamepad and even a mouse and keyboard. And using that, then I was able to push up the in-game settings to their absolute limit with DLSS, of course, no frame gen, capped at 40. And it looks really good that way, actually. That ended up becoming a pretty decent way to experience the game, I would say. And it was with reflex enabled. It was still rather responsive, even with a mouse. Although at that point, I feel like a gamepad is best if you're playing at 40 FPS. But it's kind of like this interesting trade-off where I could reduce res and effects, more like some of the res stuff, and drop the high-end ray tracing features down just a smidgen, and then use frame gen, and then I'm back up in 80s, 90s in terms of perceptible frame rate, and it's pretty good. But the 40 FPS mode, there's definitely something to it where it's like, oh yeah, it feels like you're getting a peek at the game at its best.